The entire court would later speak of the silence that fell after the emperor spoke, but they were all laughing when the duchess held the girl down. They laughed when the silver hairpin, glowing orange from the candle's flame, moved toward her cheek. Elara felt the heat before she felt the pain. It was a scorching promise, a wave of shimmering air that made her eyes water. She was on her knees, her arms pinned behind her by two of the Dowager Duchess Vespera's ladies-in-waiting. Their fingers were like talons digging into her flesh, their perfumed silks a suffocating cloud around her head. In front of her, Vespera stood tall and rigid, her face a mask of aristocratic fury. "A lesson in value, little bird," Vespera hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that cut through the nervous tittering of the assembled guests. The pre-wedding feast had turned into a trial, and Elara was the one being sentenced. The hand holding the hairpin was not Vespera's. It belonged to Lyra, her fiancé's mistress, a woman with eyes as sharp and cruel as broken glass. Lyra smiled, a slow, triumphant curl of her lips. She was enjoying this. They were all enjoying this. Elara's gaze flickered past them to him. Duke Alaric, her soon-to-be husband. He stood by the grand fireplace, one arm resting on the marble mantelpiece, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He watched the scene with an air of bored detachment, as if observing a minor piece of theater arranged for his amusement. He would not save her. He was the one who had condemned her. He had called her to this private chamber an hour ago, his voice on the edge of a sneer. His mother was with him, along with a dozen of their closest sycophants. They had presented her with a document, a falsified audit claiming her family's estate. Silverwood was not just modest, but utterly bankrupt and mortgaged to the hilt. It was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction, but they delivered it as gospel. "Your father was a fraud," Alaric had said, his voice smooth and cold. "He sold me a hollowed-out ruin. This marriage was to be an alliance, not a charity case." Elara had tried to speak, to deny it, but Vespera had cut her off. "Silence. We have been insulted. We took you in, a girl from a forgotten line, and this is how your family repays us? With deceit?" Then came the true purpose of the evening. Vespera had gestured to Lyra, who had been waiting in the wings like a patient vulture. The hairpin was produced. The plan was revealed. "The wedding will proceed," Vespera had declared, her eyes gleaming with a terrible light, "but not as an alliance of equals. You will come to my son with nothing, and you will wear the mark of your family's shame, a reminder for all to see of what you are." Now the heat was an inch from her skin. Elara refused to scream. She would not give them the satisfaction. She met Alaric's eyes across the room, a silent, desperate plea. He simply raised his glass in a mock toast and took a slow sip. His indifference was more painful than any fire. That was when Lyra pressed the glowing tip of the pin into the soft flesh of her left cheek. The world dissolved into a white-hot starburst of agony. The smell of her own burning skin filled her nostrils, acrid and sickening. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a sound of feigned shock and secret delight. Through the haze of pain, Elara heard Vespera's voice, sharp and final, delivering the phrase that would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. "No one marries a ruined face for free," the Duchess proclaimed, her voice ringing with triumph. "Now you will truly know your place." The ladies-in-waiting released her. Elara crumpled to the floor, her cheek a universe of searing pain. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. She could only lie there, trembling, the sound of their retreating footsteps and muffled laughter echoing in the vast, cold room. The great oak door clicked shut, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence. She lay on the cold stone for what felt like an eternity, the pain a living thing, a fiery serpent coiling around her face. Tears welled, hot and salty, but they were tears of rage, not sorrow. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on her, trying to crush the very breath from her lungs. They thought they had broken her. They thought they had won. How had she been so blind? For months she had ignored the whispers, the snide remarks, the subtle ways Alaric and his mother had reminded her of her lesser status. She had believed it was just the normal arrogance of the high nobility. She had wanted to believe in the man she was to marry, the alliance that was supposed to secure her family's future. She had wanted to be loved for herself, not for what she might possess. A bitter, broken laugh escaped her lips, a sound that was half a sob. Loved for herself. What a fool she had been. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of a silver platter on a nearby table. She forced herself to look. A raw, red line, already beginning to blister, traced a cruel path from the corner of her eye down to her jaw. It was ugly, it was vicious, it was meant to shame her, to mark her as damaged goods, a worthless bride. They had made one critical, fatal error. They assumed her family's worth was in their lands, their title, their gold. They had no idea where the true power of House Silverwood lay. They saw a quiet, unassuming girl from a minor house. They did not see her father's daughter. Her father, Lord Valerius, had been gone for 2 years now, but his lessons were etched into her soul. He was a man who saw the world not as it was, but as a series of interconnected systems of levers and fulcrums. "Wealth is not a pile of coins, Ilara," he used to say, his voice a low rumble as they sat in his study, the scent of old parchment and wood smoke filling the air. "True wealth is control. It is knowing something no one else knows." Her father had known something, a secret he had guarded for decades, a secret he had passed on to her and her alone. He had taught her to be unassuming, to be underestimated. "Let them think you are a lamb," he had advised, his eyes twinkling. "A wolf in sheep's clothing is merely a predator. But a dragon disguised as a lamb, that is a strategist." The pain in her cheek was a fire, but it was igniting something else within her. A cold, hard resolve was crystallizing in the pit of her stomach. They wanted her to know her place. Oh, she would, and on her wedding day she would teach them theirs. Her mind raced back to her father's study, to the heavy iron-bound ledger he had entrusted to her on his deathbed. It was bound in simple, worn leather, looking like nothing more than a dusty accounting book. But inside, written in a cipher only she and he knew, was the true history of their house, a history of quiet, meticulous, and absolute economic domination. The source of their power was not land, but what lay beneath it. Sunstone, a rare, luminous mineral that was the key component in the empire's most powerful alchemical formulas and the forging of its strongest steel. For generations, the lords of Silverwood had secretly controlled the largest and purest deposits in the known world. They sold it through a labyrinthine network of shell companies and trusted agents, its origin a fiercely guarded secret. The imperial court, the great houses, even the emperor himself, all bought their sunstone through intermediaries, paying exorbitant prices, never knowing that the quiet, unassuming House Silverwood held the monopoly. Alaric's family, House Valerius, was one of their biggest and most indebted customers. The ledger contained it all. Every transaction, every shipment, every loan extended to other noble houses who were living beyond their means. And for the past 5 years, the largest and most desperate borrower had been Duke Alaric himself. He had been funding his lavish lifestyle, his political ambitions, and his mistress on credit extended by the very family he so openly despised. Credit he had no idea was coming from them. The document they had shown her tonight, their proof of her family's bankruptcy, was a pathetic forgery. They were trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover, to seize her lands through marriage and intimidation, believing they were worthless tracts of forest. They had no idea they were trying to steal the goose that laid the golden eggs, and they were doing it with the goose's own money. The irony was so bitter, so perfect, it was almost laughable. Alaric thought he was marrying a pauper to get his hands on some worthless land. In reality, her dowry was his debt, a debt so colossal it could swallow his entire house whole. Ilara stood up, her movements stiff with pain and burgeoning purpose. She walked to the window and looked out over the glittering capital city. The ducal palace was a beacon of light and power, but it was a power built on lies, on borrowed time. Her father had been wary of this match. "Alaric is a peacock, my dear," he had warned her gently, "all flash and feathers but hollow inside. Be careful he does not see your worth, only your use." She hadn't listened. She had seen Alaric's charm, his charisma, and mistaken it for substance. She thought of the promise she had made her father. To keep their true wealth a secret, to find a partner who would value her for her mind and her heart. Alaric had failed that test in the most spectacular way imaginable. Now, a new promise was forming in her heart, a promise of retribution. She needed to get a message out. Master Kyle, her family's steward and her father's most trusted confidant, was in the city, staying at a discreet inn. He had the original copies of all the loan agreements, the promissory notes signed with Alaric's own arrogant flourish. He had the real ledgers. She moved to the writing desk. Her hand trembled as she picked up a quill, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline. The pain in her cheek was a constant throbbing reminder of what they had done, of what was at stake. It was no longer just a scar, it was a declaration of war. She wrote a short coded note, a phrase only Kyle would understand. The peacocks are plucking their own feathers. It is time to open the cage. She sealed it with a drop of wax, leaving no official sigil. She then rang a small silver bell, the one meant to summon a servant. A young maid, barely a girl, entered, her eyes wide with fear and pity. She had clearly heard the commotion. She curtsied low, avoiding Elara's gaze, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I need this delivered," Elara said, her voice surprisingly steady. She held out the note and a single gold coin. The coin was from her private purse, one of the few things she had brought with her. It was more than the girl likely earned in a month. "To the Gilded Griffin Inn, to a man named Kyle. It is urgent. Say nothing to anyone." The maid's eyes darted from the coin to Elara's face, finally landing on the angry red mark. Her expression softened from fear to genuine sympathy. She took the note and the coin, gave a quick, determined nod, and scurried away. Elara was alone again. The first move had been made. Now she had to play her part. She had to be the broken, shamed bride they expected her to be. She had to let them walk deeper into the trap they had set for her, a trap that was now closing around them. She went to the bed, the grand canopied monstrosity that was supposed to be her marriage bed, and lay down. She did not cry. She did not rage. She closed her eyes and began to plan. She replayed every conversation with Alaric, every condescending remark from Vespera, every piece of financial data her father had ever taught her. The anger was a cold, clean fire now, burning away the last vestiges of her naivety. They had wanted to shame her. They had wanted to reduce her to nothing, but they had only succeeded in awakening the dragon her father had so carefully raised. The wedding was tomorrow. They expected her to arrive veiled and weeping, a symbol of their absolute victory. She would arrive veiled, yes, but she would not be weeping. She would be carrying their ruin in her hands. The hours before dawn were the longest of her life. Every throb of pain in her cheek was a reminder of her purpose. She thought of Master Kale receiving her note, his grim, loyal face understanding immediately. He would be gathering the documents, preparing the case. He was more than a steward. He was a master of finance, the architect of her father's hidden empire. Together, they had all the weapons they needed. But a weapon was useless without the perfect moment to strike. And what better stage than a royal wedding, in front of the entire court, the highest nobles of the land? A place of ultimate public triumph for Alaric would become the stage for his ultimate public humiliation. A faint gray light began to filter through the heavy velvet curtains. Morning was coming, her wedding day. A grim smile touched Elara's lips, a strange and painful expression on her injured face. It was not the wedding day she had ever imagined, but it would be a day the Empire would never forget. They had scarred her face to shame her. They had no idea they had just armed her. Sleep did not come. Instead, her mind drifted back, sorting through memories, seeking the patterns her father had taught her to see. She remembered the day Alaric had proposed. It had been in the public gardens, a grand gesture with him on one knee, a ring with a diamond the size of a robin's egg. It was all for show, a performance for the gossiping nobles who watched from the balconies. Even then, a small part of her had felt a chill. His words were perfect, but his eyes were calculating. He was not looking at her. He was looking at what she represented, an ancient name, a docile wife, and lands that would consolidate his power on the northern border. Her father had been alive then, though frail. When she told him, he had simply nodded, his gaze distant. "The Valerius family has always been ambitious," he had said. "Ambition is a fire that can warm a house or burn it to the ground. Watch him, Lyra. See which way his fire burns." She had been too caught up in the fantasy to see the truth. Alaric's fire burned only for himself. She recalled a dinner a few months ago. Vespera had been questioning her about Silverwood's trade exports. Lyra, following her father's instructions, had been deliberately vague, speaking of timber and wool, the modest, visible products of their estate. Vespera's smile had been thin and condescending. "Quaint," she had said, the word dripping with disdain. "I trust my son will be able to bring your quaint operations into the modern age." They were not just arrogant, they were lazy. They had seen the surface and assumed it was the whole truth. They had never bothered to dig deeper, to question why a minor house had never once asked for a loan, never once been in debt, in a court where borrowing to maintain appearances was as common as breathing. Their pride had been their blindfold. The ledger her father had given her was her shield and her sword. She could picture its pages in her mind, the elegant coded script that looked like flowing poetry but was, in fact, a meticulous record of numbers and names. Each entry was a nail for Alaric's coffin. There was the loan for the new wing of his palace, the one with the gilded ceilings. There was the line of credit to purchase the matched set of white stallions for the royal parade. There were the staggering sums funneled to Lyra for her jewels and gowns, all disguised as agricultural investments. Alaric had signed every promissory note, every contract, believing he was borrowing from faceless moneylenders in the free cities. He never imagined the gold was flowing from the very vaults he planned to plunder. And then there was the worst of it, the part that elevated his actions from mere greed to high treason. The ledger detailed Alaric's secret dealings with the Western warlords, the Empire's sworn enemies. He had been selling them information, tactical weaknesses of the imperial legions, in exchange for wiping away some of his more unsavory gambling debts. He was a traitor. This was the key. Her personal grievance was one thing. Exposing a traitor to the crown? That was another matter entirely. That was a weapon that could not be ignored, not even by the emperor himself. The sun was higher now. Soon the servants would come to prepare her for the ceremony. They would bring the opulent wedding gown, the silks and lace meant to transform her into a duchess. Today, it would be her battle armor. As if on cue, there was a soft knock on the door. It was not the pitying maid from last night. It was Vespera's personal attendants, two stern-faced women with cold eyes. They entered without waiting for a response. "The Duchess sends her regards," one of them said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "She hopes you have had time to reflect on your good fortune." They began the process of dressing her, their hands rough and impersonal. They handled her like a doll, their movements efficient and contemptuous. They washed her face, their cloth carefully avoiding the raw wound on her cheek, not out of kindness, but as if not to tarnish their own fingers. They laid out the dress. It was a masterpiece of white silk and silver thread, so heavy with pearls it was difficult to lift. A gown fit for a queen, meant to display the wealth and power of the house she was marrying into. The irony was suffocating. As they laced the bodice, pulling it cruelly tight, Lyra remained silent and still. She let them work, her mind focused, her resolve hardening with every tug of the laces. They thought they were dressing a sacrificial lamb. They had no idea what was stirring beneath the silk. "You will wear the veil until the final vows are spoken," the other attendant instructed, holding up a thick embroidered veil that would completely obscure her face. "The Duke has commanded it. He is being merciful, hiding your imperfection." "I understand," Lyra said, her voice a quiet murmur. Let them think her cowed. Let them believe their cruelty had worked. The more confident they were, the harder they would fall. When they were finished, they left her, a vision in white, a prisoner in pearls. She stood before the long mirror, a faceless bride, the shape of her wound a faint shadow beneath the thick lace. She looked at her reflection and saw not a victim, but a warrior about to walk into the arena. A knock came again, softer this time. The young maid from the previous night slipped in, her head bowed. In her hands she carried a small leather-bound book. Her eyes met Ilara's for a fleeting second, and in them, Lyra saw a spark of defiance. "From Master Kyle," the maid whispered, pressing the book into Ilara's hands. "He said you would know what to do with it." It was a copy of the main ledger, not the original, which was too dangerous to transport, but a perfect transcription containing the most damning evidence against Alaric. the pages detailing his debts and his treason. Kyle was a genius. It was small enough to be concealed within the voluminous folds of her wedding gown. "Thank you," Elara breathed, her voice thick with genuine gratitude. She pressed another coin into the girl's hand. "You have served your house well today." The maid scurried away, and Elara quickly hid the ledger in a secret pocket sewn into the inner layers of her skirt, a feature her own seamstress had insisted upon for carrying personal effects. Another small foresight, another piece of her father's careful planning, falling into place. The trumpet sounded in the courtyard below. It was time. Walking to the cathedral was a surreal experience. The halls were lined with guards in the valerious livery of crimson and gold. Nobles in their finest attire averted their eyes as she passed, whispering behind their hands. She could feel their pity, their scorn, their morbid curiosity. They all knew what had happened last night. The story had surely spread like wildfire. The poor, shamed bride being forced to go through with her wedding. She held her head high beneath the veil. Let them whisper. Let them look. Their judgment meant nothing. They were merely the audience for the play she was about to direct. She reached the grand entrance to the cathedral. The massive doors were open, revealing a cavernous space filled with light from the stained glass windows. Every great house in the empire was represented. Hundreds of eyes were on her. At the far end of the aisle, standing before the high septon, was Alaric. He looked magnificent, a prince from a storybook. He was dressed in a doublet of white and gold, a ceremonial sword at his hip. He stood with an air of supreme confidence, a faint, smug smile playing on his lips. Beside him, in the front pew, sat his mother, Vespera, looking like a queen enthroned, her expression one of pure, unadulterated triumph. As the music swelled, Elara began her long walk down the aisle. Her steps were measured and steady. She did not falter. With each step, she felt the weight of the hidden ledger against her leg, a cold, hard reminder of her purpose. This was not a walk to her marriage. It was a march to their execution. She could feel Alaric's gaze on her, even through the veil. He would be expecting tears. He would be expecting a bowed head, a trembling figure. She gave him none of it. She walked with the poise and grace her father had taught her, the bearing of a woman who knew her own worth, regardless of what marks she bore. She reached the altar and stood before him. He took her hand. His grip was proprietary, his fingers cold. "You are surprisingly composed," he murmured, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. "I expected a more emotional display." "I'm here to honor our arrangement," Lyra replied, her voice a placid, emotionless stream. His smile widened. He believed her. He truly believed he had won, that she had accepted her fate. His arrogance was a monument, and she was about to topple it. The high septon began the ceremony, his voice droning through the ancient rites. Elara listened to the words about union, about trust, about honor, and a cold fury burned within her. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The ceremony moved toward its conclusion. The septon spoke of the joining of houses, the sealing of alliances. He asked for the ceremonial signing of the marriage contract. A scribe brought forward a lavishly illuminated scroll. Alaric signed his name with a confident flourish. Then he produced a second document. "In the matter of the dowry," Alaric said, his voice loud enough for the front pews to hear. He unrolled the second scroll. It was a deed, transferring all lands and titles of House Silverwood to him. A formality to correct the unfortunate misunderstandings of the past. He held out the quill to her. This was it. The final provocation. The moment he intended to complete her humiliation, forcing her to sign away her birthright in front of the entire world. The cathedral was silent, everyone watching, waiting. Vespera was leaning forward, her eyes gleaming. Elara took the quill, but she did not move toward the deed. Instead, she reached into her dress and pulled out the small, leather-bound ledger. She placed it on the altar beside the other documents. Alaric stared at the book, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What is this? Some sentimental diary?" "This," Elara said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent cathedral, "is the true dowry. The complete and accurate accounting of your house's debts to mine." A murmur went through the crowd. Alaric's smile faltered. Vespera's face tightened. "What nonsense is this?" Alaric snapped, reaching for the book. Elara placed her hand on it. I think not. With her other hand, she slowly, deliberately lifted her veil. A collective gasp echoed off the stone walls. The scar was livid against the paleness of her skin, a brutal, angry red. But it was her expression that stunned the crowd into silence. There was no shame in her eyes, no fear, only a cold, unwavering fire. She looked directly at Alaric, whose face had gone from confusion to a dawning, horrified understanding. "You scarred me," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous register. "You and your mother. You did this to mark me as worthless, to shame me into signing away my home." "This is outrageous," Vespera cried from her seat, rising to her feet. "She is hysterical. The shame has driven her mad." "Shame?" Ilara's laugh was a sharp, cutting sound. "No, Your Grace, this is not shame, this is collateral." She opened the ledger. "For 5 years, Duke Alaric, you have been borrowing from my house. You have funded your palaces, your parties, your mistress, all with silverwood gold. Gold you thought was coming from foreign bankers who would never trace it back to you. You owe my house a sum so vast, your entire estate could not cover half of it." Alaric was pale now, his composure shattering. "Lies! Forgeries!" "Are they?" Lyra asked calmly. "Your signature is on every promissory note. Master Kale has the originals. This is merely a copy for today's negotiation." She flipped a page. "And then there's the matter of treason." The word hung in the air, heavy and deadly. The silence in the cathedral became absolute. Even Vespera seemed to be struck dumb. "Selling imperial secrets to the Western warlords," Lyra continued, her voice like ice. "Trading the lives of imperial soldiers to cover your gambling debts. It's all here, Alaric. Every date, every contact, every piece of silver you took in exchange for your loyalty to the crown." Alaric lunged for the book, his face a mask of fury and panic. "You lying witch!" He never reached her. At that exact moment, the great doors of the cathedral boomed open. Every head turned. Framed in the doorway, flanked by a dozen of his elite imperial guard, stood the emperor himself. Emperor Kalin was a young ruler, known for his quiet intensity and his intolerance for corruption. He was not a man to be trifled with. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the altar, on Ilara and the pale, trembling duke. He stopped before them. His gaze moved from the ledger in Ilara's hand to the ugly scar on her face, and finally to Alaric. The emperor's expression was unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Lord Chancellor," the emperor said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. A gray-haired man stepped forward from his retinue. "Your Imperial Majesty," the chancellor said with a bow. "Examine the evidence," the emperor ordered, gesturing to the ledger. The chancellor took the book from Ilara's unresisting hands. He was a renowned scholar and jurist, a man whose integrity was beyond question. He scanned the pages, his brow furrowing. The silence in the room was so profound, Ilara could hear the frantic, panicked breathing of the duke beside her. After a long, tense moment, the chancellor looked up, his face grim. He met the emperor's gaze. "The cipher is one I recognize from the late Lord Valerius of Silverwood," the chancellor announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "He used it in his private correspondence with the crown. The financial records appear authentic. And these entries," he paused, his expression hardening. "These entries detail acts of high treason against the empire." That one sentence sealed their fate. It was a pronouncement of guilt from the highest legal authority in the land, delivered in the presence of the emperor. There was no appeal, no escape. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of a world shifting on its axis, the silence of a great house falling, the silence of absolute ruin. Vespera let out a choked cry and sank back into her seat, her face the color of ash. Alaric stared at the emperor, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, no words coming out. His arrogance, his confidence, his entire world had been dismantled in the space of 5 minutes. Ilara stood tall, the pain in her cheek forgotten. She looked from the shattered duke to his collapsed mother. Then she spoke, her voice steady and clear for all to hear. She looked directly at Vespera, then at Alaric. "You said no one marries a ruined face for free," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You were right. The price for this scar is your entire house." The callback of Vespera's own cruel words, turned into a sentence of judgment, was the final, devastating blow. A wave of shock and dawning comprehension washed over the assembled nobles. They were not just witnessing a scandal. They were witnessing a reckoning. The emperor's gaze settled on Ilara. He studied her face, his eyes lingering on the scar not with pity, but with a strange, assessing intensity. He saw not a victim, but a survivor, a strategist, a woman of immense courage. He then turned his full attention to the duke. "Alaric of House Valerius," the emperor said, his voice like the striking of a funeral bell. "You are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your name. You and your mother are under arrest for high treason and conspiracy against the crown." The imperial guard moved forward, their armor clanking in the silent cathedral. They seized Alaric and a stunned, babbling Vespera. Alaric struggled, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and rage. "You cannot do this," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I am a duke of the realm. This is my wedding." "Your wedding is over," the emperor said, his voice flat and final. "Your life as you know it is over." The guards dragged them away, Alaric still screaming threats and denials, Vespera weeping hysterically. The crowd watched, mesmerized and terrified. The fall was so swift, so absolute, it was hard to comprehend. One moment, they were at the apex of power. The next, they were prisoners destined for the deepest, darkest dungeon in the imperial palace. As for Lyra, the mistress who had held the hairpin, she had fainted in her seat. Ilara glanced at her, a crumpled heap of silks and jewels. She felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a sense of waste. She had been a pawn, a cruel and willing one, but a pawn nonetheless. Ilara turned to the emperor and gave a deep, respectful curtsy. "Your Majesty, I thank you for your swift justice." The emperor looked at her, and for the first time, a hint of something other than stern duty entered his eyes. It was respect. "Lord Valerius was a true friend to the crown," he said. "He spoke of you often. He said you were the sharpest mind in his house. I see now he was not exaggerating." He stepped closer and gently, with one finger, tilted her chin up, examining the scar more closely. The entire court held its breath. "They did this to shame you," he said, his voice softer now, for her ears only. "To declare you worthless, fools. A scar is not a mark of weakness. It is the mark of a warrior who has survived a battle. The empire needs warriors, Lady Ilara, not peacocks." He then raised his voice, addressing the entire stunned assembly. "The alliance between the crown and House Silverwood, an alliance forged by the lady's father, is of paramount importance to the security and prosperity of this empire. That alliance will not be broken by the treason of fools." He paused, letting his words sink in. What he said next would change the course of her life and the course of the empire forever. "This wedding will proceed," the emperor declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The alliance will be sealed today. As the groom has proven himself a traitor, I will take his place." A tidal wave of shock rolled through the cathedral. It was an unprecedented, earth-shattering announcement. The emperor himself, marrying a minor noblewoman, a woman who had been publicly scarred and shamed only hours before. It was unthinkable. He turned to Ilara, his expression serious. "Lady Ilara of Silverwood, will you accept my hand and stand by my side as empress of this realm?" This was not a proposal of love. It was a political masterstroke. It would secure the Sunstone monopoly for the crown directly, punish the traitors in the most public way possible, and send a clear message to the entire nobility. Loyalty would be rewarded beyond measure, and treachery would be met with absolute ruin. And for her, it was the ultimate vindication. To be raised up by the highest power in the land, at the very moment she was meant to be cast down. She looked into his eyes, the eyes of a ruler, a strategist, a man who understood power. She saw a partner. She saw a future she had never dared to imagine. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I will." The emperor nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm, a stark contrast to Alaric's cold, clammy touch. He led her to the altar, to the bewildered high septon. "Continue the ceremony," the emperor commanded. And so, in the same hour that she had been meant to become a shamed and powerless duchess, Lyra of Silverwood became the empress of the realm. The scar on her cheek, intended as a mark of disgrace, became a symbol of her astonishing rise, a story that would be told in whispers and legends for centuries to come. Her revenge was not just complete, it was transcendent. She had not just ruined her enemies, she had taken their place at the pinnacle of the world. The immediate aftermath was a blur of calculated motion. While the court was still reeling, the emperor's will was enacted with swift and brutal efficiency. Imperial guards sealed the Valerius palace, seizing all assets. Every member of their house, every sycophant who had laughed in that room last night, was detained for questioning. The vast, corrupt network that Alaric and Vespera had built crumbled in a single afternoon. Elara stood by the emperor's side, no longer a bride in a borrowed palace, but the mistress of the imperial citadel. The transition was jarring, the scale of it immense. She was escorted from the cathedral, not to a ducal carriage, but to the emperor's own gilded transport, the symbol of his absolute power. As they moved through the city, the news spread ahead of them like a shock wave. People lined the streets, their faces a mixture of confusion, awe, and fear. They had come to see a duke's wedding. They were witnessing the birth of a new empress. Inside the carriage, the silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. Elara finally had a moment to process the whirlwind of events. The pain in her cheek was a dull, persistent throb, a physical anchor in the sea of unreality. "Are you overwhelmed?" Emperor Calin asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. He was watching her, his dark eyes searching her face. "I am adjusting, Your Majesty," she replied honestly. "Calin," he corrected her. "We are to be husband and wife. Titles are for the court." He paused, then said, "Your father was a great man. He served the empire in ways few will ever know. He kept the Sunstone supply stable and secure, preventing our enemies from ever gaining control of it. He trusted you with his legacy. I intend to honor that trust." This was the crux of it. This was not a fairy tale. It was a strategic alliance, the continuation of a pact made between her father and her new husband. And yet, looking at him, she felt a sense of rightness, of a path clicking into place. He had not seen her scar as a flaw. He had seen it as a sign of her strength. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. "My father taught me that loyalty is a currency more valuable than gold," she said. "My loyalty is to the empire. And to you, Calin." He nodded, a look of satisfaction on his face. "Good. We have much to do. The Valerius treason runs deep. We will need your knowledge of their finances to root it all out." He was already treating her as a partner, an advisor, not a trophy, not a vessel for an heir, but a mind to be utilized. The contrast with Alaric was so profound, it was almost dizzying. Before they reached the palace, she made a request. "Lyra," she said, speaking the name of the woman who had scarred her. "The mistress, what will become of her?" Caelin's face hardened. "She will be tried as an accomplice to the assault on a member of the imperial family. The punishment is death." Elara took a deep breath. She thought of the woman's smug smile, the pleasure she had taken in inflicting pain. A part of her wanted that justice, that final, brutal retribution. But her father had also taught her about mercy, about the difference between justice and vengeance. "I would ask for a different sentence," Elara said quietly. "Banishment. Let her be stripped of her wealth and sent away. Let her live a long life with the knowledge of what she did and what she lost. Death is an ending. I want her to have to live with her choices." Calin studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are more merciful than I would be," he said finally, "but the request is yours to make. It will be done." This small act was for herself. It was a way to prove that what they had done to her had not made her as cruel as they were. She would not be dragged down to their level. She was an empress now, and an empress had to be more than just a purveyor of revenge. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. She was given chambers in the palace that made the Valerius estate look like a country cottage. A team of the empire's best physicians tended to her cheek, their poultices and salves soothing the fire, though they told her the scar would remain. She found she did not mind. It was a part of her story now, She worked alongside Calin and his chancellor, poring over the Valerius documents. Her father's ledger was the key that unlocked everything. With her knowledge of the cipher and the hidden financial network, they unraveled a conspiracy that was even worse than she had imagined. Alaric had been plotting a coup, using his connections with the Western warlords to plan an invasion, after which he would install himself as a puppet emperor. Her wedding was meant to be the final piece of the puzzle, securing the wealth he needed to fund his treason. She had not just saved herself. She had saved the empire. As the full scope of the plot was revealed, Calin's respect for her grew. He would summon her to the strategy room, not just for her financial acumen, but for her opinion on political matters. He listened to her, truly listened, valuing her insights. They were a team, partners in the truest sense of the word. A month after the wedding, a small private ceremony was held in the palace's sept. It was a reaffirmation of their vows, a quiet, personal moment away from the prying eyes of the court. Calin had commissioned a new wedding ring for her, a simple band of white gold, inlaid with a sliver of raw, glowing sunstone. "To remind us of the foundation upon which this empire is built," he said as he slipped it on her finger. "Strength, secrecy, and a light that shines in the darkness." In that moment, looking at him, Elara felt the last vestiges of her old life, of the naive girl who had dreamed of marrying Duke Alaric, fall away. She was no longer that person. She was Empress Lyra, a woman forged in fire and betrayal, now standing in the light. The fate of Alaric and Vespera was decided by the High Council. They were found guilty of high treason. Their execution was public. Elara did not attend. She had no desire to see them die. Her victory was in her survival, in her success. Their downfall was merely the closing of a chapter she had already moved on from. Section a year passed, then another. The empire, under the joint guidance of Emperor Calin and Empress Lyra, entered an era of unprecedented prosperity and stability. The sunstone trade, now managed directly by the crown under Alara's supervision, filled the imperial coffers and funded vast public works, new roads, aqueducts, libraries, and hospitals. Lyra became beloved by the people. They called her the Sunstone Empress. Her scar, once a subject of gossip, was now seen as a badge of honor. Young women in the court even took to painting a thin silver line on their cheeks as a fashion statement, a symbol of strength and resilience. She had taken a mark of shame and transformed it into a symbol of power. Her relationship with Calin deepened from a political alliance into a genuine partnership of love and respect. He was a good man, a just ruler, and he admired her mind as much as he grew to love her spirit. He was patient and kind, the antithesis of the arrogant duke she had once thought she loved. He never shied away from her scar, often tracing it gently with his thumb as they spoke, a silent acknowledgement of the battle she had won to be with him. They had a son, a boy with his father's serious eyes and her own sharp intellect. They named him Valerius, in honor of her father. One evening, 5 years after that fateful wedding day, Elara was standing on a balcony overlooking the capital. The city was aglow with thousands of lights, a testament to the peace and prosperity she had helped build. Calin came to stand beside her, wrapping a strong arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She touched the scar on her cheek. It was a faint silver line now, smooth beneath her fingertips. "I was thinking about how a single moment can change a life," she said, "and how sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you can turn out to be the best." He kissed the scar gently. "They tried to bury you," he whispered. "They didn't know you were a seed." Far away, in a desolate penal colony in the frozen north, a man named Alaric and a woman named Vespera toiled in the mines, their names forgotten, their legacy erased. They were nothing, ghosts haunted by the memory of the power they had lost. Lyra, the former mistress, lived in a small fishing village on the coast. Her beauty faded, her hands raw from mending nets, forever in exile. Elara looked at her husband, at the thriving city below, and felt a profound sense of peace. Her father had taught her to be a strategist, to see the world in terms of power and control. But her own journey had taught her something more. She learned that a scar is not a mark of shame, but a testament to a battle survived. and that true value is never on the surface for fools to see, but is a quiet strength waiting for the right moment to claim its kingdom. She had claimed hers, not with fire and rage, but with intelligence, courage, and a resolve that could never be broken. She was living the life she truly deserved, a life she had built not from the ashes of her past, but from the light of her own inner strength.